what is imposter syndrome? So imposter syndrome is when you're in a situation, maybe you got a promotion, maybe you won an award, maybe you got a good grade, or maybe you did something awesome, right? And it feels like you shouldn't be, like you don't feel deserving of it. You feel like you're a fraud, even though you may have worked hard to get to it, right? Even though you may have done the thing. Imposter syndrome is when you feel like, oh, I'm any minute now, someone's getting, like I felt like this before with my job, right? Where like I enjoyed it so much more than what I was doing before that I was like, okay, any minute now, someone's going to come yank me out of here and put me back in my shitty retail job. Right. It's like, it's just feeling like that you are an imposter in a situation, right? Like there's no way they give me this, right? There's no way I deserve this. And you don't even have to be in a situation where bad things happen to you all the time, right? Even some of the biggest celebrities and actors and speakers and authors and stuff like that, they feel like this shouldn't be my situation. I feel like that sometimes at work. I just got promoted a few months ago, and I'll still feel like that where I'm like, why? Not that I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just kind of like, how did I get here, right? How did I end up doing that? And also imposter syndrome could be like, you ever taken a test, right? Taking a big test and you thought, I bombed that shit. I did not do good. There's no way, it's going to be terrible. And you found out you had like an A. You found out you got actually a good grade even though you felt terrible about it. Well, yeah, like a lot of times when people feel like they don't deserve something, like not to say that's exclusively the truth, but there's a lot of people who do deserve things that don't feel like they deserve them. And that's imposter syndrome. It's what we used to call just getting lucky. Not always. Sometimes you do work really fucking hard, right? You work really hard and you just don't feel like you did well, even as hard as you worked, because you ever study so much where you like start to doubt yourself because all of a sudden everything's kind of swimming around in your head. I've been in that situation before. It's a big problem for people who genuinely believe they don't deserve good things. Yeah. I mean, every time like in college when we would have a get together or a party, I was absolutely convinced no one was going to show up. Right. And then it ends up being a great time. People show up. It gets wild, like stuff like that. Like I always felt like I was, no matter how many times, we became, for where I worked and for the people I worked with and went to school with, we became kind of I was like the only person in our group that had their own house, right? At that age. So naturally you become the party, right? The party house, especially in your early and mid 20s. So every time we had one of these get-togethers, we would go all out. We'd get everything set up. We'd, get everybody, known about it. And I would always, no matter how many times we did it, I would always feel like people were going to show up. That's imposter syndrome. When you don't feel like people are going to, arrive. Self-doubt. Is it like self-doubt? I don't know if it's as much self-doubt. I mean, I guess it's kind of a form of self-doubt. That was motivation for you. What were you self-doubtful about that pushed you through? What did you end up doing? It also feels like it happens more to people who make themselves or take themselves too seriously. Like you did put in the work, but somehow that gets blanked out and you just see yourself where you are in that seemingly undeserved spot. Yeah, like you get these little bitty boosts where you're like, oh, that worked out. That's great. But then immediately, like it is a motivator for people to work hard, but sometimes it's a motivator for people to work like really fucking hard. Like, not that that's a bad thing, but sometimes, you tread that line of being almost over obsessive about it. Like you have to be hungry about things, but like you tread that line of being over obsessive about it. Sometimes it's more of a misvaluation of self-worth. Like, why should I be here? I didn't work that hard when maybe you did. Yeah. You're so like, especially when you're working towards something, sometimes you're so in the moment of it that you're like, that's gotta be terrible. Right. It happened to me all the time with podcasting. Right. And when I would do these like monster podcasts with with a guest. I talk 2 or 3 hours with someone and with someone brand new, and like it's all a blur, and you come out of it being like, I don't think that went well. I don't think I did good there. I think that sucked. And then you go back and listen to it, you're like, oh, or someone gives you feedback and you're like, oh, okay, it was okay. Like I'm unable in the moment sometimes to gauge how well it's going, And it's been very rare over the 300 and something, episodes I did of that show. Like, it's been very rare where I actually had something that was garbage, right? I only ever threw out like a couple of episodes. I mean, I got beat up for getting bad grades, and I improved myself, got a good job and much money. I mean, you got beat up. So is that you beating yourself up though? Like, I understand that people can motivate you in different ways, right? Whether they're good or bad ways. But like, this is more like a thing that's inside of you. It's not outside forces, even though outside forces can contribute to the way you feel about your imposter syndrome, right? I think imposter syndrome can also be external too, like from your jealous peers who are envious and lash out. That can affect you for sure. I mean, you can be a product. It can be external. Yeah, it can be. Like, so for instance, the article I was reading about it said something along the lines of, well, I'll get to that in a second, but sometimes it has to do with how you're treated when you're a parent. When your parents, like, especially if you have siblings and someone's treated like, oh, that's the smart one, right? It's mean, and I'm sure they don't mean it mean, right? But it still creates a thing for the person that's being called the smart one. Never mind the fucking issues it's causing for the other sibling, right? I struggle with it from time to time. There are times when I'm all caught up with work things and I have tons of downtime, and it makes me feel like they are paying me and I'm sitting here and doing nothing. You work in IT? It's hard to gauge your worth in those moments because you're just so like, you're not in it. You know what I'm saying? You're not in there slinging the mud, right? Let's see. So the two people who it was two ladies that actually had come up with the concept of imposter syndrome. And they finally had gotten together after years of feeling like, I don't deserve to be where I'm at. And these people are like PhDs, they're people who are very, very successful in their fields. Their original paper identified 2 distinct family patterns that gave rise to imposter feelings. They focused on women, but either women had a sibling who had been identified as, quote, the smart one, or else they themselves had been identified as superior in every way: intellect, personality, appearance, talent. The pair theorized that women in the first group are driven to find the unrealistic faith in their capacities and the experience of fallibility that life inevitably brings. For both types of imposters, the crisis comes from the disjunction between the messages received from their parents and the messages received from the real world. Are my parents right that I'm inadequate, or is the world right that I'm capable? Or conversely, are my parents right that I'm perfect, or is the world right that I'm failing? The imposter begins to do everything possible to prevent being discovered in her self-perceived deficiencies. Clance and Eames cite one client who, as a child, quote, pretended to be sick for 3 consecutive Fridays when spelling bees were held. She could not bear the thought of her parents finding out she could not win a spelling contest. Another client pretended to be playing with art supplies instead of studying whenever her mother walked into the room, because her mother had taught her that being naturally smart that naturally smart people don't have to study. Clance and Eames describe the cycle that imposter feelings often produce: a sense of impending failure that inspires frenzied hard work and short-lived gratification when failure is staved off, quickly followed by the return of the old conviction that failure is imminent. And that's the fucking truth, right? That's the truth right there. Societal pressures from antiquated times utilized to manipulate the working class. It's not even that. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with, like, a lot of times loving your kids. Like, I talk about this all the time when we talk about our daughter. Like, you got to be careful what you say. Like, you got to be careful. Like, you don't want to give them a complex to either direction, right? You won't want them to feel bad about themselves, but you also don't want them to have unrealistic confidence, right? So of course you see your kid learning all this stuff. You see your kid getting older and figuring things out, and like you see where other people are, other kids are maybe not up to that, but like it's kind of like a back and forth, right? Like sometimes a kid will get a surge in development and other kids will then catch up to them and pass them, like, and it goes back and forth like that. So you got to always be careful to not give them like too big of an ego about themselves, right? And while at the same time not discouraging them. Like, so, if we were to ever have a second kid, right? We joke, right? We're like, she's so smart. What if the next one's dumb? Like we say stuff like that joking, right? But like you don't want to put that out. Like you try not to put that out there, right? I think it also helps to not be the parent who lives vicariously through your kids. Like how you want Gregina to like stuff you do, but aren't being overbearing about it. Yeah, you just kind of have to see, you just gauge their interest in stuff. You have to also understand that people, like, especially when they're young, they float in and out of interest. For a while, it's like all about elephants. It's all about, lions and tigers and unicorns and stuff like that. And then, all of a sudden, like one day she's just like completely fascinated by stars and the moon, right? She's discovering stars. Like she wants to go outside at night to see the stars. So it's seeing what the interest is and just kind of helping it along, not being like, oh, you must want to be an astronaut. Let's go get you all this astronaut shit. Like it's kind of crazy. And then like, also you don't want to push anything like that. Like I've always had the daydream, right? I've always had the daydream even before we got pregnant. I was like, man, I think it would be badass to do a podcast or a show with your kid, right? Probably a podcast where it's just audio only. You don't want to put them on camera too fucking early, right? But like where they grow up and you just have conversations. But like, that's my thing. That's not like, I can't force that on her. Like I can let her know that's a thing she can do if she shows interest, but it's such a weird line to walk. It's such a weird line to walk. Parents need to be parents. Just got to stop trying to be their friend or their puppet master. You want to be open and honest with them enough and have their trust enough to where they want to come talk to you about anything, right? They want to come talk to you and they trust you and that you're going to support them and, all that stuff, right? You want that. But you don't want to be like cool parent. You don't want to be like, hey, come on, bring your friends over here. And as long as y'all stay at the house, y'all can drink. Like, you don't want to be that parent either. Like, that's the parent you look out for. That's the one that ends up getting a little too handsy, right? You don't want to be that parent. So as far as the imposter syndrome goes, like, Sean, you'd be a good person to talk about imposter syndrome with. From your days playing baseball to your days playing on the stage, right? To playing live music, playing with big bands, opening for, big names and being on the same, festivals and stuff like that. There had to be so many moments where you're like, why the fuck am I here? Like, how am I here in this situation? I know you had a ton of other stuff going on, but still, like, there still had to be moments where you're like, holy shit, man, who's going to come pull me out from backstage any moment now? And I'm sure that kind of eases out over time, but like, damn, dude, that's such a weird situation. When I was in radio and I had all this access to, I had all kinds of media credentials and stuff like that to go to all these Atlanta sports stuff. Pretty much anything Atlanta sports I could go to and I could walk just like any reporter. I could walk into the locker room. I had media credentials, right? It was crazy, man. It was weird. Like, I was like, why am I here? Why are they letting me do this? Then I told myself I was a badass and got on with it. See, some people can't do that. Like, I have a tough time with that, man. Like, I never felt like especially in the radio thing, because it happened so fast and I worked so hard to get where I got in a pretty short amount of time. I got pretty damn far in the business. You end up in a top 10 market. You work your ass off. You do internships and you essentially work for free. And, then all of a sudden you're getting paid and you're working on a morning show. You're producing, you're an on-air personality, and it's surreal. I was so tired too, because I'm sure, Sean's wife can attest to this. When you do morning radio, you don't live like everyone else. Your schedule is like no one else's schedule ever. You just never feel like you should be there I never got that comfortable. And maybe that would go away if I'd had a longer career in radio. Getting out of any complex or syndrome takes real effort. Yeah, it does. It does. Because your brain gets wired a certain way and it's hard to make it feel different. It's like, kind of like when you're addicted to something, like your brain just gets wired to feel that way. It's hard to let it go. Doing well in school, like when I get recognized for something at school, like in high school or even in college, like it felt weird. And when I get an award at work recognition or promotions, in some cases, you're like, I'm not the type of person that has to have recognition. It's nice. Like I understand why people enjoy it and it's nice, but I always felt odd going up and accepting an award, like, oh, you're employee of the month, you're kick ass, blah blah blah, something like that. And it's just kind of like, ugh, I feel weird about it. Weirdly, just in the last 3 or 4 years, professionally speaking, I've realized I belong at that level I'm at. Yeah, it takes a while, man. It takes a while for people to settle the fuck in. It really does. I mean, there's also something to be said for people who do get comfortable. I think the syndrome risks being replaced with arrogance, a kind of forgetting your roots. Yeah, that's always the other thing, right? You see that when people get famous, they get bigger, they get busier. And sometimes I don't even know if it's arrogance as much as like it's everything's such a blur. I don't know if they necessarily realize that it's coming off as dickish. Not saying there aren't people that are not dicks, right? But I'm saying, like, when you get to a certain level, especially when we're talking about entertainment, when you're talking about, sports, anything like that, like everything's a blur. When I was doing radio, it was such a blur, and I wasn't even a big deal in radio. I grew up being belittled and berated, so I have way checked out, usually on needing someone's approval. I am my own cheerleader. Yeah, that's not a bad way to be, Cronenberg. I think about it from a parenting perspective, right? And you don't want to be so supportive that it's unrealistic, right? So handholdy that there's that your kid becomes older without ever experiencing like true disappointment, right? But you also can't just belittle a person. As much as you use that as your motivation, or like who was it that was in here? Cithron, who was in here earlier, used getting beat up as motivation. There's just as many, if not more, people that go the opposite direction and they feel worthless the rest of their lives.